Jasmine Crockett stepped into the studio of Jimmy Kimmel Show with a steady breath, feeling the heat of the overhead lights and the buzz of the live audience just behind the curtain. Her phone was off, tucked deep in her purse, and her mind was focused not on the noise outside, not on the recent headlines, but on the moment in front of her. Jimmy had personally reached out to invite her on the show after her fiery exchange on the house floor made headlines. A moment that millions had seen and discussed, twisted and retweeted, praised and mocked. But tonight wasn't about going viral. It was about taking control of the narrative. As the stage manager gave her the signal, Jasmine walked calmly into the light, her heels clicking softly against the studio floor, the cheers rising around her, not as noise, but as fuel. Jimmy stood up from his desk with a grin that blended welcome with curiosity, reaching out to shake her hand before gesturing to the chair across from him. "Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett," he said, turning to the camera with his signature blend of charm and sarcasm, "who has managed to make C-SPAN interesting again?" Laughter rippled through the audience. Jasmine smiled but didn't lose focus. She sat, adjusted her mic, and waited as Jimmy settled back into his seat. He didn't waste time. "So, you've had quite the week. You clashed with Marjorie Taylor Greene, then Trump decided to call you low IQ. That must have been fun." The room chuckled again, but Jasmine leaned in, her tone grounded, her delivery sharp. "It wasn't fun, Jimmy. It was familiar," she said, her voice firm, but not angry. "Because every time a black woman stands up and speaks clearly and unapologetically, we get labeled. Too loud, too angry, not smart. And yet, we keep showing up. We keep doing the work." The applause that followed wasn't the type that fades quickly. It lingered, grew louder. Jimmy nodded, sensing the weight in the room shift. He didn't cut to commercial. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his chin on his hand, genuinely listening now. "Do you think they attack you because they're afraid of what you represent?" "They attack what they don't understand," Jasmine replied. "And what they refuse to understand, they try to discredit. But I'm not going to waste time defending my intellect to people who wouldn't survive a day in my district." Her eyes were locked with his, and the audience felt that this wasn't a soundbite. This was lived experience. Jimmy shifted gears slightly, careful not to trivialize what she was saying, but also trying to guide the conversation to something more personal. "Has this moment changed how people treat you? Your colleagues, your community?" She exhaled slowly, choosing her words. "It's a double-edged sword. The people who already had my back, they're louder now. More visible. I've gotten letters, calls, even prayers from folks I've never met. But the hate's louder too, more confident. That's what happens when certain public figures model disrespect. It gives others permission." Jimmy blinked, paused, then said, "And by public figures, I'm guessing you don't mean the Pope?" The audience laughed again, referencing Greene's bizarre tweet about the Pope supporting human trafficking. Jasmine smirked. "I mean exactly who you think I mean." The mood lightened slightly, but Jasmine's presence still carried the seriousness of someone who hadn't just come here to entertain. Jimmy, sensing that, leaned back. "You know, I've had senators, actors, athletes sitting where you're sitting right now, but rarely do I feel like I'm talking to someone who really knows who they are. You've got that." She nodded, appreciating the comment, but not getting caught in the flattery. "Knowing who you are is the only way you survive in Washington. And let's be real, the city doesn't exactly roll out the red carpet for women like me." Another pause. Another round of applause. This wasn't a performance. It was a presence. As the show wrapped to a break, Jimmy looked at her with something more than admiration, maybe respect, maybe recognition. "Congresswoman, I hope you keep coming back. This place needs more truth." Jasmine smiled again, more relaxed now, but still composed. "Then you better keep that seat warm." The audience laughed and applauded, and as the show cut to commercial, Jimmy stood and shook her hand again, this time with a firmer grip. Off camera, She leaned in and said something quietly that the mics didn't catch. He smiled, nodded, and walked with her backstage. The segment might have ended, but for many watching at home, something had just begun. Backstage was quieter, but the energy still lingered in the air, like the echo of applause hanging just beneath the surface. Jasmine Crockett walked beside Jimmy Kimmel down the narrow hallway that led away from the bright lights of the studio and into the soft shadows of the production area. He still carried the relaxed confidence of a late-night host, but there was something more thoughtful in the way he walked now, like he understood he hadn't just interviewed a guest. He'd been handed a mirror reflecting something deeper about the country they both lived in. Jasmine wasn't smiling anymore. Her expression had shifted into something harder to name, something halfway between focus and exhaustion. She thanked the crew with polite nods as they passed by, but her mind wasn't in the hallway. It was still on the couch, in front of the cameras, playing back the things she'd said and the even more important things she hadn't had time to get out. Inside the small green room where she'd prepped before the show, her phone was lighting up already dozens of texts, missed calls, even more social notifications. Her staff would filter through most of it, but she knew how this game worked. She'd said something real on national television, and now the world would spin it in every direction. She picked up the phone but didn't unlock it. She just held it in her hand, like it might cool the heat that was still building in her chest. Jimmy stepped in behind her, his voice softer than it had been on air. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded without turning, just thinking, trying not to think too much. He paused for a second, reading her tone before stepping closer. "You know, I meant what I said out there. This place doesn't see people like you often. And when it does, most folks are too scared to speak truth." You didn't flinch. She looked over her shoulder at him, her expression easing just a little. "I don't have the luxury of flinching. When I walk into a room like this, I'm already on the defense. My presence alone challenges people. My voice? That's a threat to the status quo." Jimmy nodded. "So what's next? After a night like this, what do you do? Go back to DC and fight another fight?" She chuckled, but there wasn't much humor in it. "That's exactly what I do. Tomorrow, I fly out, and the next day I'm in a committee hearing, pretending that some of these folks don't see me as less than human. But tonight was important. Not for me, well, not just for me, but for every young black girl who saw me sit on that couch and speak clearly, directly, without apology." There was silence for a beat, not awkward, not forced. Just two people letting the weight of a real moment settle. Then Jasmine walked to the small fridge, grabbed a water, twisted it open, and took a long sip before sitting on the edge of the couch. Jimmy sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "You ever get tired of being strong all the time?" he asked. She didn't answer right away. She looked down at the floor, then back up at him. "Every day. But the world doesn't pause just because I'm tired. I didn't run for office to be comfortable. I ran because my community deserves better. And if being strong is what it takes, then I'll do it. But yeah, I get tired." Her voice cracked just slightly on that last word, and she didn't hide it. Jimmy leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "I've had a lot of people sit in front of me and talk about politics, but you talk about people, like real people, not poll numbers." Jasmine leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees now, mirroring his posture. "Because that's what it's about. People forget that. The suits and the sound bites and the fundraising emails. It all becomes this performance. But my people back home, they don't care about who won the debate. They care about whether their kid's school has working heat, whether their rent's going to spike next month, whether the hospital down the street still takes their insurance." Jimmy nodded slowly, and there was a stillness in the room that felt rare, like neither one of them wanted to break it. Then a producer peeked in to give Jimmy a time check, and the moment slipped slightly, but not completely. Jimmy stood up, gave her a warm handshake that lingered a moment longer than necessary, and said, "If you ever need this space again, It's yours. No cameras, no scripts, just space." She thanked him quietly, standing as well, and they walked back toward the exit. As the door opened, a few audience members who had waited near the side hallway caught sight of her. A young girl, no older than 13, nudged her mom and whispered something that made Jasmine pause. She turned, locked eyes with the girl, and gave a small wave. The girl's face lit up. She turned back to her mom and whispered again, louder this time. "That's her. That's the one who told the truth." Jasmine smiled for real then, a full smile that reached her eyes, the kind you can't fake even if you tried. She didn't say anything, just nodded and kept walking. Outside, the night air was crisp. Her driver opened the car door, but she stood there for a moment, looking up at the city lights, feeling the weight of the day settle deeper in her bones. She'd done interviews before. She'd faced off with opposition before. But tonight felt different. Not because of the cameras or the applause, but because she'd shown up fully, without softening, and left something behind in that studio, something honest, something undeniable. And tomorrow, when she stepped back into the noise of Washington, into the clashing voices and calculated chaos, she would carry that moment with her like armor. Because the work wasn't done, the truth hadn't been finished. But for one night, she'd made sure it was heard. Jasmine Crockett stepped back into the studio like she'd never left, but everything felt different this time. The corridor she walked through had the same lighting, the same smell of backstage coffee and studio-grade air conditioning. But now people stopped mid-step when they saw her, heads turning in unison, murmurs starting before she even passed them. The first time she had come, people were curious. This time they were tuned in. Jimmy had invited her back personally, no PR layer, no producer go-between, just a direct call that came with no preamble. "We need your voice again. Things are moving, and you moved them." That invitation hung in her mind as she adjusted her blazer and pushed open the final door to the green room. It was quieter than before, just a light hum of television noise from a monitor playing highlights from last night's show. Her eyes found the screen but didn't linger. She sat down and took a slow breath, preparing not just to speak, but to land with intention. Jimmy entered a few minutes later, casual as always, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, but his tone was different when he greeted her. "Welcome back, Congresswoman," he said, and this time the joking lilt in his voice had been replaced by something closer to reverence. Jasmine smirked slightly and stood to shake his hand, her grip firm but easy. "Glad to be here, Jimmy. I see the lights didn't scare you off the first time." He laughed, gestured toward the hallway and said, "Scare me off. You lit the place up. Let's do it again." They walked side by side toward the stage entrance, and as the audience warmed up behind the curtain, she could hear the subtle shift in tone from the crowd. It wasn't just excitement, it was anticipation, the kind that crackled in the air before a moment that mattered. Once the intro rolled and the applause rose like a tide, Jimmy greeted his audience with the same charm, but it was clear he was building to something weightier. After a few quick jokes and topical news bits, he leaned forward in his seat and said, "Now, folks." Our next guest made waves the last time she sat in that chair, not just because of what she said, but because of how she said it. "Please welcome back to the show Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." The audience erupted, the kind of standing ovation that isn't manufactured or coaxed by a producer. Jasmine walked out with calm confidence, shaking Jimmy's hand before settling into the chair that already felt like it belonged to her. The applause took longer to die down this time. People weren't just clapping, they were thanking her with their hands. Jimmy leaned in first. "All right, Jasmine. You've had a busy couple of weeks since your last visit. I gotta ask what changed for you after that night." Jasmine didn't hesitate. "Jimmy, I'll tell you what changed. I went back to Washington, and suddenly I wasn't just the Congresswoman from Texas anymore. I was the woman who said what people were too polite or too afraid to say out loud. That night didn't just stir up noise. It clarified where people stand. Some folks didn't like it. Others felt like they were finally seen. But either way, it made people look up. Jimmy nodded, his expression serious. You've been front and center in some pretty heated debates since then. Particularly after that incident with the Education Subcommittee. You want to talk about that? She smiled tightly, not out of humor, but strategy. Sure, let's talk about it. I called out a colleague who tried to label public schools as indoctrination zones. And I did it in plain language. I told him what he was really doing, using fear to justify ignorance. That clip went viral, and suddenly I was either a hero or a threat, depending on which side of the aisle you sat on. The crowd responded with low murmurs and claps, understanding the weight of her words. Jimmy let her continue. But Jimmy, the truth is, I'm not in Congress to babysit fragile egos. I'm there because the people who sent me didn't have time for platitudes. They wanted policy. They wanted change. They wanted someone who wouldn't back down just because a room got uncomfortable. Jimmy raised an eyebrow. So what's next? You've got this momentum now. Are you thinking bigger? Jasmine leaned back in her chair, thoughtful. It's not about bigger for me. It's about deeper. I want to dig into the root of these systems. Education, housing, justice, and not just treat symptoms. That means pushing legislation that's going to piss off lobbyists and challenge narratives. But if I wanted easy, I would have stayed home. I didn't come to Washington to warm a seat. There was a pause, the kind that made producers nervous because silence on television was risky. But Jimmy didn't move to fill it. He let it breathe. Then he asked, do you ever worry about burnout? About carrying this weight every day? Jasmine looked out at the audience for a moment, then back at Jimmy. Of course. There are days I wonder how much of myself I'm allowed to keep. How much I've given to this job. But then I get a letter from a high school senior in Houston who saw that hearing and decided to register to vote for the first time. Or I hear from a mother who tells me her daughter dressed up as me for career day. That's what refills my tank. That's what keeps me going. The camera panned slowly across the crowd, and you could see the emotion on people's faces, some nodding silently, others blinking back unexpected tears. Jimmy broke the silence with a softer voice than usual. You've got fire, Jasmine. But you've also got heart. That's a rare combo in this town. She gave a small nod. It has to be both. Fire gets you noticed. Heart keeps you grounded. They wrapped the segment with a few lighter moments, but the tone of the evening had already been set. This wasn't just television, it was testimony. Jasmine had turned a late-night couch into a platform for truth-telling. And as she stood again to wave to the audience, the ovation came not from surprise, but from respect. She walked off stage the same way she came in, centered, strong, and real. The following evening, Jasmine Crockett was back inside the same dressing room, but this time with a different mission. Jimmy's team had called not just to follow up, but to ask if she'd stay for an extended segment longer than any guest that week. The people are still talking, his producer had said. We're seeing something we don't usually see, a shift in what people want out of these conversations. They want truth, not spin. And they're listening to you. Jasmine had smiled politely at the call, but inside, she already knew. She'd seen the letters flooding into her office. Not just from her district in Texas, but from college students in Chicago, retired veterans in North Carolina, even a group of high school civics teachers in Arizona who had paused class to show clips of her hearings. That night on Jimmy's show wasn't just a moment, it had become a ripple, stretching into places she hadn't expected, reaching people who'd tuned out of politics long ago. And now, stepping into the studio again, she wasn't there to repeat talking points. She was there to go deeper. Jimmy was waiting near the hallway that led to the stage, sipping from a coffee cup and flipping through cue cards. "Congresswoman," he said as she approached, voice light but eyes serious. "You ready to break the internet again?" She chuckled, "Only if the internet's ready for facts." He grinned, tossed the cue cards to an assistant, and motioned her forward. "Let's skip the softballs." Let's talk about what actually matters. As the lights dimmed and the opening theme began to play, Jimmy gave her a quick nod. It wasn't a cue, it was respect. He knew who she was and why she was there. The applause rose as the cameras panned across the crowd, and Jasmine walked out to thunder again. Not out of celebrity fanfare, but the kind of response you give someone who's earned your attention with clarity and courage. Jimmy greeted her. They exchanged a quick hug, and he wasted no time. "Let's just go straight in," he said, settling into his seat. "You've been a major voice around what happened this week with that budget standoff. And you called it out in a way nobody else did. You said, and I'm quoting, 'This wasn't a negotiation. It was political extortion disguised as fiscal discipline.' Can you unpack that for us? You've been a major voice around what happened this week with that budget standoff. And you called it out in a way nobody else did. You said, and I'm quoting, 'This wasn't a negotiation. It was political extortion disguised as fiscal discipline.' Can you unpack that for us?" Jasmine leaned forward, hands folded, her voice measured but firm. "Sure, Jimmy. What we just saw wasn't compromise. It was a small faction of extremists threatening to tank the economy unless the rest of Congress gave in to their demands. They weren't negotiating in good faith. They were holding the American people hostage. And when I called it that, some of my colleagues called me dramatic. But I'm sorry if someone walks into a room with a match and a can of gasoline and says, 'Give me what I want or I'll light this whole thing up.' I'm not going to call them a bold strategist. I'm going to call them what they are, dangerous." Jimmy leaned back in his chair, the crowd clapping as he did. "So what happens next? What do you do when people don't want to hear hard truths?" Jasmine didn't miss a beat. "You keep telling them. You stay consistent. Because silence is complicity. And the truth doesn't get less true just because it's inconvenient." They talked for another 10 minutes about policy, not in bullet points but in stories about a working mother in Dallas who'd emailed Jasmine about insulin prices, about a disabled veteran who lost food benefits because of the new budget cuts. Every example had a face, a name, a reason why these issues weren't abstract. Jimmy followed each one with the focus of a man who understood he was no longer just hosting a show. He was helping tell the truth on national television. Then, halfway through the segment, Jimmy said, "You know, we've had a lot of guests sit on that couch and say things that made headlines. But not a lot of them come back to show us what they did next. You did, and we respect that." Jasmine nodded, a small smile breaking across her face. "That's the point, right? We can't just go viral. We have to go forward." As the cameras cut to commercial, Jimmy leaned over and asked, off mic, "How do you keep your fire?" She looked out at the still clapping crowd. "I remember who I'm speaking for. And I remember who's trying to silence them." When they returned from the break, Jimmy surprised her. "So, I want to close tonight's segment differently. We got some letters. From folks who saw your last appearance." Jasmine's eyebrows raised slightly as Jimmy reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. "This one's from a woman named Marisol in Albuquerque. She's a cafeteria worker at a public high school. She wrote, 'When you spoke about dignity, I felt seen. No one ever tells women like me that we matter in these conversations. You did. Thank you.'" Jasmine's throat tightened, but she kept her posture straight. "And here's another one," Jimmy continued, "from a 16-year-old named Caleb in Des Moines. He said, 'I used to think politics was just rich people yelling. Then I saw you. Now I think it might be something more.'" The audience had gone quiet, not out of boredom but reverence. Jasmine exhaled slowly. "That's why I show up. Not for the cameras, not for the titles, but because somewhere out there, someone is watching and realizing that their voice matters too. Even if it shakes, even if it's just getting started." Jimmy nodded. "Well, Congresswoman, I think I speak for everyone when I say we're glad you're speaking." They ended the night not with a laugh, but with standing applause once again. Not out of entertainment, but because she had once again turned a late-night talk show into a platform for something honest, something urgent. As the applause faded and the cameras slowly began to roll back to the off-air position, Jasmine Crockett sat back in her chair. The bright studio lights, which had shined down on her all night, seemed to dim slightly in the quiet after the show's live taping. She wasn't a politician in this moment. She was just a woman who'd spoken the truth on a stage where many before her had been content to smile, entertain, or deflect. But Jasmine had done none of those things. She had shared what she believed, not as a spectacle, but as a mission. A mission to inspire, to ignite, and to give people hope that their voices mattered in this broken, chaotic political system. It was the kind of message that wasn't always popular, but it was always necessary. Jimmy Kimmel had long since wrapped up the taping and was giving a few final instructions to his crew. Jasmine sat there for a moment, catching her breath. The night had been intense, a whirlwind of political talk, personal stories, and raw honesty. She had known going into the show that it would be a tough conversation, but what she hadn't expected was how deeply it would resonate. How the smallest moments, like the letters from Marisol and Caleb, would remind her why she fought. Not for the headlines or the applause, but for the people who needed to see that there was someone out there who cared, who was listening, and who was willing to stand up for them, even when it wasn't convenient. As the studio lights began to come down, Jasmine was approached by one of the show's producers, a woman in her mid-30s with an exhausted smile but genuine appreciation in her eyes. "Congresswoman," she said, "I've got to tell you that was something. You've really got people talking tonight." Jasmine smiled softly and nodded. "That's the idea, right?" she replied. "We can't be silent about the things that matter." The producer grinned, her voice softening. "I don't know if you realize how powerful your message was tonight. You've made a real impact. And you're not just speaking to the people who agree with you. You're speaking to the people who need to hear it most, the ones who are just starting to wake up and realize what's happening around them." Jasmine didn't say anything at first. She just nodded, letting the weight of those words sink in. Backstage, she ran into a few of the crew members who had worked on the segment, and they all shared their appreciation, offering her kind words of encouragement. But it was one of the makeup artists, a woman named Erica, who stopped Jasmine in her tracks. Erica, who had been quiet the whole time, finally spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "Congresswoman, I just wanted to say thank you." Jasmine looked at her with genuine curiosity, unsure of what to expect. Erica continued, "I've never really followed politics before. I always thought it was all the same. But when you spoke tonight, it was like something clicked for me. You gave me hope. You reminded me that politics is about more than just laws and policies. It's about people. It's about real lives, real stories. And it's about standing up for what's right, even when it feels impossible. You made me want to get involved." Jasmine felt a lump in her throat, a tear almost escaping her eye. She hadn't expected a moment like this. But here it was. "You're not alone in this," Jasmine said quietly, her voice steady but full of emotion. "We're all in this together. It's never going to be easy, but if we all do our part, we can make things better." Erica nodded, her eyes glistening with newfound resolve. "Thank you," she whispered again. "I won't forget this." And in that moment, Jasmine realized something that hit her harder than any applause or headlines ever could. This was the real victory. Not the political battles won in Washington, but the small victories, the ones that didn't make the front pages but changed someone's life for the better. The ones that gave someone the courage to step up, to speak out, to take action. Those were the moments that mattered most. Later that night, as Jasmine was heading back to her hotel, she received a text from one of her closest allies in Congress, a longtime friend who had been with her every step of the way. The message simply read, "You did it tonight. You spoke truth, and people listened. That's how change happens. Keep pushing, we're with you." She smiled at her phone, feeling a weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't just the validation. It was the reminder that there was an army of people, of everyday Americans, who were standing right beside her, ready to fight for the things that mattered. As she laid down that night, the quiet hum of the city outside her hotel room, Jasmine thought about what had brought her here, what had driven her to this point in her career. It was never about power or position. It was always about the people. The women who felt forgotten, the men who couldn't afford their medicine, the children who needed a better future. That was the reason she had entered politics in the first place, and that was the reason she would never stop fighting. The next morning, as she prepared to leave the hotel and head back to her office in Washington, she couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. It was a rare feeling in politics, a feeling of contentment, of knowing that she had done her part, that she had spoken truth to power, and that the world was listening. There would always be more challenges, more battles to face, but for now, Jasmine Crockett knew one thing for sure: she had made a difference. Not just on the show, not just in the halls of Congress, but in the hearts and minds of those who needed to hear her message. And that, in the end, was what truly mattered. As she walked out of the hotel and into the bright morning sun, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be long and full of obstacles, but as long as there were people like Erica, like Marisol, and like Caleb, people who were ready to step up and demand more, Jasmine knew she wouldn't be walking that road alone. And with that, the story came full circle. The truth had been spoken, the people had been heard, and the change they had all been waiting for was finally beginning to take shape.
Thank you for watching our channel Modern Stories. If you liked our video, you should subscribe for more amazing videos like this. Have a healthy and happy day. See you in the next one.